Dank u wel voor de uitnodiging om vandaag met u te spreken. Ondanks de uitkomst van het Brexit-referendum vorig jaar wilde ik u laten weten dat Vlaanderen veel vrienden heeft aan de andere kant van het kanaal. Het is een genoegen om hier te zijn. In mijn spraak, diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad i ddod i siarad gyda chi heddiw. Mae'n bleser mawr i gweld gymaint o bobl yn Ysgynhynllydfa. So, thank you ever so much for the opportunity to be with you here. It's really a privilege to see so many people really interested in subjects that I'd have difficulty filling a mini if I wanted to speak to people about fiscal devolution in Wales sometimes. It's just so wonderful to see so many people interested in these subjects today, and it's a great event that has been arranged. Today, just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Similarly to the first presentation, looking at some of the regional, economic and industrial disparities across the various parts of the United Kingdom, which you'll see quite similar to the first presentation. There really are some quite big variances between the UK, quite a lot of inequalities between the various regions. I'm then going to look at some of these questions about transfers and how the various regions and nations of the UK have traditionally been funded, and more importantly, why that's been a source of grievance right across the UK, and why that system is radically changing right now, as was just mentioned, the radical increase in powers to Scotland on the tax front, for example, and also Wales. The UK politics, as I'm sure you're aware, it seems to be changing on a daily basis right now, and so I want to try and spend some time as well looking at not only the causes and the consequence of the Scottish independence referendum, but also what happened next, this big transfer of additional competences to Scotland. And then, just to cover a short menu of topics today, I want to talk about Brexit, and particularly why that's such a big challenge within the UK, why there isn't a unified position as much as the central government would like to claim there is, and why Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all view a version of the soft Brexit as being most in their interests. And just because so much has changed with Brexit and the election last week, excuse me if I do skip through a couple of the earlier slides, as I think that's, since these have been printed, I think there's some really important things to get out there. So first, to look a little bit about the major economic discrepancies within the UK. It's one of the richest countries in Europe, as we know, but it's also one of the countries with the largest amount of discrepancies. So while London, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, London has a gross value added, that's a kind of related to GDP. It has 171% of the UK average, a very rich part of both Europe and of the UK. But you can see that Wales and Northern Ireland very, very far below those levels. And you can see on the map there that you've got the southeast of England and actually Scotland performing relatively well. The north of England, and particularly Wales and Northern Ireland, performing well below the average UK economic performance. So interestingly, how does Belgium compare with these economic discrepancies? And actually you can see when you compare it with an EU average, so 100 is the EU average on GDP, this is purchasing power, but you can imagine if this is average EU GDP per head, then you can see Flanders performing significantly better than that, right in line with southeast of England, which is the region right around London, Scotland being right on that European average, but you can see that Wallonia and then Northern Ireland and Wales performing even worse on a GDP basis than Wallonia. So even though we had a discussion just now about the discrepancies within Belgium, actually the discrepancies within the UK are even more stark, as you can see there, and Wales being surprisingly perhaps even having a worse GDP figure than even Northern Ireland, despite 3 decades of conflict, in Northern Ireland. So I suppose the question is, why would the Welsh government be supporting tax devolution, which they have, and I'll get onto that in a moment. The other talk was about the question of fiscal transfers, because if you have a system where there is quite significant regional variation between the nations and regions of the United Kingdom, clearly the regions on their own aren't going to be able to sustain the level of public services that would be expected in a modern welfare state just from their own resources. So you can see from this graph that there is actually only 3 regions within the United Kingdom as a whole that actually put money into the UK tax pot, that put in more than they would get back in public revenues, and that is London, the southeast, and the east of England, all around that kind of southeast England economic powerhouse of the UK. You can see on a per person basis, both Northern Ireland and Wales, a significant deficit per person, and that is funded not as directly as it is in Belgium, but it certainly is funded by an implicit transfer, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the consequences of this, of course, is that the poorer regions of the UK, Wales being no exception, suffers from a brain drain. So you can see this is migration between Wales and England. In fact, there's not a lot of net migration. As a whole, there's pretty much, there's no large population flows from one to the other, but there are significant differences in who's moving between the people who move back and forth. And you can see in the early 20s, huge numbers of people educated in Wales leave Wales to the big cities of England, and you can see that when they start to want to have families, maybe come back home, have grandmom and grandpa's help with raising kids or whatever, they would tend to move back to Wales. So we do have this significant problem in a brain drain where we're losing a significant portion of educated people to the major cities in England. Now, what does this all mean in terms of the tax base in the UK? Well, because a lot of industrial and economic activity is occurring in London and the southeast of England, it means that the UK government is ever more dependent on revenues raised from this small region of the UK, geographically, not population-wise, for the revenues of the whole state. And you can see that just in the 2 regions of London and the southeast are raising almost 40% of all revenues raised in the United Kingdom, and that is just increasing. We've seen, despite many, many governments saying we want to address the disparities between the different regions, actually you've seen the problem getting worse. And you can see income tax in the purple, you can see just the proportion being raised in London on the various taxes. This is just not the case in other regions of the UK. I mean, ultimately, spatial economic imbalance in the UK has got a lot to do with the concentration of political, financial, economic power in London and the city and in surrounding regions. And the UK has one of the most centralised systems of public finance, policy making and political control amongst the OECD nations. And this creates a kind of vicious cycle. So if you have a reliance on London, especially the square mile, the City of London, the financial district, it means that UK governments are tailoring economic policy to ensure strong growth, that this area is not hurt by economic downturns and so on. And that is sometimes, because there's winners and losers in any policy game, that's sometimes to the detriment of the post-industrial regions, which then in turn creates increasing dependence on the industries that London has. So despite successive governments of whatever political colour saying that they want to rebalance the economy, actually none of this has been successful. And what it has resulted to normally is just grant pots being made available for regional investment, but actually no shift in the underlying policy or regulations that might have significant improvements. And you can see consequences of this focus in statistics like public infrastructure expending in the UK. Now, of course, any large metropolitan area is going to see large investments, or should see large investments in public transport. But you can see in the UK, it is really quite stark the extent to which per capita spending is in the London region. This is spending on transport per person. And you can see London, almost £2,000 per head, compared with just about £200 per head spent in the regions outside London. You might know of a very, very large project, a £15 billion project being constructed right now. It's almost complete, called the Crossrail project, that's building a new rail tunnel all the way through London. Obviously, really important for the businesses in the London area, but the argument here is that there's been a focus on economic growth in London, the southeast of England, potentially to the detriment of other regions as well. You can see another example. This is government spending on research and development. This is going to universities, and there's plenty of universities, myself teaching at one of them that is a research university in Wales, but you can see again concentration on government spending in the southeast of England. Interestingly, this isn't the case for the private sector. Private sector figures on R&D are very, very much more balanced between the regions of the UK. Again, potentially saying something about government policy and the consequences of having a centralised, one-size-fits-all government policy. So, how does this centralisation in terms of finance work in practice? Well, traditionally, and this system is changing as of this year, but traditionally, almost every single tax that you would pay, from income taxes to corporation taxes to VAT, would be collected centrally by the UK, except for your municipal taxes, which will go to your local council. Every other source of taxation would go to London to be redistributed back down the system. And these are the three devolved governments. We've got Holyrood in Edinburgh, Stormont in Belfast, and Cardiff Bay. This is the National Assembly for Wales. And the UK government then makes a transfer in one block grant each year, about 28 billion to Scotland, 15 billion to Wales, and so on. This is calculated by an incredibly controversial formula that I'll come on to in a minute. But you can see basically that up until very recently, the entire budgets for the three devolved governments were set by a decision in London on the size of those budgets. So even though the Scottish government had huge numbers of powers over how to spend the revenue it gets, actually all of the money, the envelope, the limit on its budget was being set by another government. So you can see the democratic consequences perhaps of that. And then those three governments plus the London government for England will then make grants down to municipalities and so on. So this is one of the most centralised systems in the developed world. And as I mentioned, the three devolved countries are funded primarily by a single block grant. And it's calculated by an incredibly controversial formula named after Joel Barnett, who came up with it as a temporary measure. And often in politics, temporary measures are the most long-standing measures. So this gives very full flexibility to the three governments, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, on how to spend that money, total flexibility, but the amount of money is set by Westminster. Now, how does this work? We actually don't have a system of equalisation, so we're actually very unusual in OECD countries. There's no assessment of relative needs or relative tax raising capacity of the various nations. In a very traditional British fudge way, it's been set from the prior year's spending plus a small change, which we call an uplift or a consequential on the prior year. So what this happens is that for every, say the UK government decides to build a new hospital in England and it spends £100 million on a new hospital. As a result of that decision to build a hospital in England, there's an automatic increase to the budget in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on a population basis. So every project that the UK government builds in England, they have to add another 8% for Scotland, another 5% for Wales, and another 3% for Northern Ireland on top of the cost of the project to build the hospital or whatever project in England. So it's a really interesting, euphemistically, system where actually it's not based on needs. There's no annual calculation of the relative merits. It's just been based on this increasing formula back to 1980 when it was introduced. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that there's a huge accountability problem. And this is why, one of the major reasons why all the parties in the government in Wales and Scotland, whatever political hue, have wanted to change the formula and the way that the governments are financed. Because, quite simply, there's no direct link between the budgets of the three countries that are involved and the taxes that they raise from the local populations. So, elections become fights over how to divide the pie and not how to grow the pie. Because if there is an increase in taxes in Wales, in the current system, the Welsh government gets no benefit of that increase at all, because it's still funneled straight back into London and then comes back down the formula. So there's been a real, very little incentives for politicians to talk about growing the economy. It's been much more about different ways in which to spend the budget that comes from Westminster. So why did this odd system survive so long? Well, as I mentioned, it came in on a very temporary basis, but it has been so difficult for the governments to reconcile competing interests between Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland that they have not been able to change the formula. It was never meant to last. This was the cabinet member at the time who brought in the formula, and he disowned it later. He said it was deeply unfair, but still, because there's been no way to work around, we've got this formula still in place. It's very, very straightforward to operate, and as you can imagine, it removes disputes from the cabinet table, because if the UK government builds a new hospital in England, it's obliged to put additional money into the three different parts of the UK. So there's that kind of, removes a little bit of that politicking around the table. But although this is a little bit unaccountable potentially, at first glance, the three devolved countries actually do better on a spending per head basis than does England. What we know on the terms of the identifiable spending, so where it's regionally based, so not like a warship or something which isn't docked in a particular part of the UK, but all the spending that we can identify is about just close to £9,000 per head in England. But in Scotland, it's a fifth higher. So 20% more per person is spent in Scotland. In Wales, 15% more per person is spent. And in Northern Ireland, a whopping 29% per person spent additionally on services and public services. So, why would the Scottish government support this, and why did it become very important in the devolution referendum, independence referendum? Well, Scotland, because of North Sea oil, has put the most into the UK tax pot every year since 1980. So the Scottish government would say, hold on, we have put in more money per head into the UK tax pot. It's only fair, therefore, that our citizens should see the benefit of that in terms of increased spending on public services. So that's one of the reasons that it became very, very political in the independence referendum, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But in the other parts of the UK, there's actually criticism of this formula. Criticism in England is very much on the fact that there's less spent per person on public services like health and education and so on. In Wales, actually, even though there's that 15% benefit, there's been criticism because of the higher levels of needs of the Welsh population. So it's greater levels of inequality, poverty, lower levels of education, greater levels of ill health and so on. So the parties in Wales have argued that actually, while there is a bonus, there should be even bigger bonus in terms of the transfers that are received from this formula. But in Scotland, there's some evidence that several billion pounds better off per year on just on the basis of needs. So there's been support for retaining the formula, and that's been particularly problematic, if you like, in terms of reaching consensus between the various parts of the UK. In terms of Scotland, of course, you all know, but there has been a very dramatic change in politics in Scotland within the last decade. What this graph shows is the degree in which people in Scotland and Wales vote differently from voting in England. So if the point was right on the bottom, on the horizontal at the bottom, it's that all the parties would gain an identical vote share in England as they do in Wales and Scotland. You can see in Wales, actually, is always voted a little bit differently from England. The last time the Conservative Party did better in Wales than in England was in the 1850s at the expansion of the democratic franchise. There's been a very, very, very long history in Wales of people voting for the Labour Party and for centre-left parties in general. And that trend is just doesn't budge over many, many years. People thought potentially this year it might, but no, again, the Conservative Party did worse in Wales than they did in England as a whole. On the other hand, actually, Scotland used to vote very similarly to England in the 50s. There was a very strong Conservative presence from Scottish MPs, but then that started to shift. And within the last decade, that is, the way that Scottish people vote has become incredibly different from the UK as a whole. Now, what did that mean, of course? Well, it meant that with a majority government by the Scottish National Party coming into office in Scotland in 2011, the UK government agreed to hold a referendum, which was held in 2014. But in terms of the public finances, what I want to talk about today, what was the trigger for major financial changes within the UK was opinion poll the weekend before the referendum that showed the yes vote ahead of 51 to 49. The three leaders of the UK parties rushed to Scotland. They cancelled Prime Minister's questions for that week, and they all agreed in a front page vow on the most widely read newspaper in Scotland, the most widely read newspaper, that there would be a large amounts of additional powers for Scotland. And one of those was that one of the pledges on that vow was that this Barnett formula, this formula that's been that's been such a source of grievance, particularly in England, that this formula would be continued. That was pledged in this vow, and it has been continued. As you know, there was a narrow no vote, but the Westminster parties did go through with changes to the way that Britain's funded in the aftermath of that referendum. You can see in the top right, those are the Scottish leaders of the three unionist parties, the Ruth Davidson, the Conservative, Joan Lamont, the Scottish Labour leader at the time, and Willie Rennie, the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats at the time. And you can see more powers for Scotland guaranteed in the backdrop. This is a photo call for the No campaign in the independence referendum. And the week following the referendum, there was a commission announced, a cross-party commission, which was sought to generate a rapid cross-party agreement on how Scotland's powers should change. This received an enormously large public engagement. I mean, the politicians and the civil servants will know just how difficult it is sometimes to get consultation responses to policy documents. Within a month, this had 17,000 public consultations writing in to this commission seeking their views on what the powers should be for Scotland. And this led very rapidly to the passage of a new piece of Westminster legislation which gives Scotland large new powers over employment support and over welfare, particularly over additional top-up payments for people who are on disability and so on. And it gives the Scottish Parliament virtually control over all the income tax collected in Scotland, and also 50% of the VAT collected in Scotland, and many, many smaller taxes. So you can, these are, it is very much along the lines of a Devo Max kind of model in Scotland now. Large numbers of taxes and expenditures being devolved. You can see down here is the amount of expenditure, all public expenditure in Scotland. Well, currently devolved is 60%, and then an additional 4% of welfare spending coming down. I can take one question. Oh, I'm going to come on to that in a moment. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah. It's a good question. But you can see in Scotland, actually, in revenues, there's also been an expansion. So these are the powers that are held in Westminster, but you can see about 40% now of all the revenues raised in Scotland are now retained by the Scottish Government. But, as the question just anticipated brilliantly the next slide, which is, it didn't stop at Scotland. So often Wales is in the constitutional slipstream of Scotland, and some of the ideas that were raised in this commission were actually raised in a separate Welsh commission about whether or not there should be similar powers adopted to Scotland in Wales. And it was a kind of a halfway house, as you might expect, given Wales's economic and different constitutional situation. There hadn't been an independence referendum in Wales, for example. But you can see there's very significant new powers to Wales coming as well. About half of the income tax is going to be devolved to Wales, in contrast to Scotland, where it's going to be most of the income tax devolved to Scotland. But you can see quite significant amounts of new money being retained from the Welsh tax base will now fund the Welsh Government budget, rising to about 20%. So in Scotland it'll be about 40% from self-run taxes. In Wales, about halfway house constitutionally and economically, it'll be about 20%. But everybody expects these debates to continue to run. This is just a chart just to show the progress of the change in Wales and Scotland's devolution settlements over a very short period of time. What this shows here is on the vertical axis, that's the share of the revenue raised locally and retained locally, and on the horizontal axis is the region's share of total spending, of total public spending, so what is Scottish or Welsh government-run services. You can see on the expenditure side, they've always had quite a large share of spending, so all education, all health spending, all transport spending is devolved. But you can see on the revenue side, there's been successive movements north, in other words, becoming more self-autonomous. And you can see Scotland moving from a very low share of self-financing income right the way up to about 40% in a very short number of years, quite rapid developments there. So, given this change, it's not the only one, of course. We have Brexit and the economy, which is really important for all of these countries, and obviously very important for Flanders and for the UK as a whole. It has very, very significant budget questions, not only for Wales, but for Scotland and the other parts of the UK. It's going to bring enormous questions about if there are repatriation of competences, which tier of government is going to hold those competences. There'll be a very, very, that'll be, in a euphemistic term, challenging, I should imagine, between the parties and the regions of the UK. Certainly the Scottish government is not going to accept any rollback of powers from Edinburgh to London, but there's certainly questions about how to maintain those policies in a much smaller market. And also the consequences of, because we've got these industrial and economic disparities in the UK, Brexit is likely to have unequal impacts on the different parts of the sectors and regions of the UK as well, and big interests that differ over the single market and customs union and trade. Just to show you one of the examples of where there's going to be very, very significant differentiation between the impact of Brexit on the four countries of the UK. You can see that these are the two major budget programmes that are received by the devolved governments, agriculture on the one hand and the structural funds on the other, the regional development policies. You can see Wales here per head getting £96 per person from the European budget for agriculture and a whopping £83 per head on regional development funding, because Wales is a really quite poor country relative to the EU averages. In fact, on GDP terms, you'd have to go 1,000 kilometres in any direction from South Wales to reach a region of the EU that's poorer in terms of GDP. So despite being in one of the wealthiest countries in the EU, there's significant regional disparities, and that's why you can see a large impact there on the structural funds. Northern Ireland, again, really, really important, the agricultural industry. There, £145 per person received from the Common Agricultural Policy, 96 in Scotland, and just £31 in England. And I'll come on to this in a moment, but it's partly because the nature of the agriculture business is very, very different in England than it is in the much more mountainous Celtic parts of the UK. So, of course, there are really, really significant impacts of these programs and on access to the single market and so on. This comes on to the fact that we've got very significant interest in the debate at the moment over whether or not there should be a hard Brexit or a much, much softer Brexit. And there's been a lot of representations from the Scottish and Welsh governments that there should be a much, much softer version of Brexit than is being considered by Theresa May's administration. This is because Wales is currently a net beneficiary of funding from the European Union. We put in less than we receive in terms of the EU budget. That's a figure me and my colleague calculated and actually featured very prominently in the debate in Wales during the European referendum. But not just the budget funds. Actually, Wales and Scotland are far more dependent on the EU for its export markets than is the case for England as a whole. In fact, more than 2/3 of Welsh exports are to the EU, compared with less than half of exports to the EU from the UK as a whole. And of course, as you might have seen in the last couple of days, we've been talking about the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland potentially supporting Theresa May's minority government. There's very serious concerns about the impact of the customs union, leaving the customs union and resulting in a hard border, with very significant concerns over the future of the peace process if that were to take place. Here's just an example of some of these regional disparities and the sectoral differences that are going to create real challenges in the Brexit negotiations. The City of London is potentially losing up to 18 billion in revenue, 30,000 jobs if there's a hard Brexit. That's because of this very, very significant role for finance, which is the yellow bar in London, and in business support services. These kind of London's key comparative advantage industries that have been such a focus of British policy support till now. But you can see on the flip side, you've got significant manufacturing on a percentage basis in Wales compared with London. So you can see that there's real differences in the approach that different parts of the UK are taking to the Brexit negotiations. Just to focus just very briefly on one of the major areas where there is difference, and that's on agriculture. Wales is, if anybody's been there, you'll know it's very mountainous. We don't have much arable land because there's very little flat land. It's very much dependent on upland sheep farming and a bit of dairy farming. And actually, because that is not a highly profitable industry, it's important for communities and it's important for the industry, but it's not a highly profitable industry. So 80% of farming income in Wales originates from EU funding, and more than 90% of the exports out of Wales beyond the EU are to the EU, less than 10% to non-EU countries. And also you've got big differences in the policy, because if you've got lots of difference in the types of agriculture, you're going to have a different approach towards agricultural policy. Wales has a much more similar agriculture industry to the small-scale, family-owned French farming, which of course is inspiring the version of the common agriculture we had for so many decades, whereas England's farming is much, much more extensive, with much larger open arable farmlands, not perhaps so conducive to the way that the common agricultural policy works. So on Brexit there, and the negotiations are set to start in 2 days, even though the programme for government in the UK has not yet been agreed. It's a really very peculiar situation that the UK finds itself going forward. Just the final topic I want to raise, which is why I wanted to get to this slide, is just the transformative general election that the UK has just had. You might remember a couple of months ago, Theresa May announced a shock, snap general election. she made the case that she needed a bigger number of, a larger majority, a larger number of Conservative MPs in Parliament to strengthen Theresa May's hand in the Brexit negotiations that are about to come. But the British people had a different view. And Theresa May has lost her majority and is currently in negotiations with the Northern Ireland's Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, to support a minority government. But given that the Brexit negotiations are starting on Monday, it's a very, very peculiar position to be in. You can see on these graphs as well this idea about the disparities and discrepancies within the UK, because you can see in each part of the UK, a different party won the election. So in Northern Ireland, none of the great British parties compete. They're all local parties. You can see the Unionist Party winning 10 seats, and in the process taking out the seats of the more moderate Unionist Party. Sinn Féin also taking 7 seats, again taking seats from the more moderate Nationalist Party. And in Wales, Labour, again, having a strong performance. They've won every election in Wales since the 1920s, so that's perhaps not a surprise. You can see the Conservatives losing 3 seats. Plaid Cymru, that's the Welsh Nationalist Party in Wales, gaining a seat up to 4 seats. You can see on the west coast of Wales there. In Scotland, although the Scottish Nationalist Party gained a majority of seats on 35, they lost 21 seats, and it's becoming a question now of whether they have the votes, the support to press ahead with an early second independence referendum. I'm sure that won't be off the table forever, but I'm sure there'll be a lot in the discussion in the Scottish National Party right now about whether or not to postpone having a second referendum, given the reduction of 21 seats that they had last week, and that I think was a shock to everybody in Scottish politics. Regardless, they still had the largest number of seats, and likewise in England, but you can see even in England, the Conservatives losing seats to Labour, really not giving Theresa May that strong negotiating hand that she wanted. So this next period, not only for the 2 years, we hope, of the Brexit negotiations, but also in the immediate attempts for her pulling together a government as well. So diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad ar y cyfle i siarad gyda chi. Thanks ever so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's been a pleasure.